everything in nature grows only where it's vulnerable. So a crustacean animal like a crab inside a hard shell, it can't grow. It has to molt and make itself very vulnerable to be able to grow. A tree doesn't grow where it's hard and thick, does it? It grows where it's soft and green and vulnerable. So vulnerability is absolutely essential for growth. And for vulnerability, you got to let go of those defenses, such as being right, that you developed as a child in order to protect yourself from the pain. So that's why we talk about growing pains, because vulnerability is necessary for growth. Without vulnerability, there is no growth.
Wow, what you just said, that is so beautiful. You just said vulnerability is our capacity to be wounded.
That's what it means, literally.
Yeah, that's an incredible definition of the word. I think we hear so many definitions of vulnerability, but that vulnerability, I'm just going to say that again. Everyone write that down. Vulnerability is our capacity to be wounded. How do we develop our capacity? So actually, let's go back to childhood. We'll come back to that. So if we go to childhood, what are the things happening currently that you perceive? And I know you talk about this in your new book, The Myth of Normal. By the way, everything we're talking about is in this incredible book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. If you don't have it, please go and order it now. What is happening in our childhood, in society? I guess when you say things are not happening to us, there are still environmental impacts that are imprinting the potential for this wound to grow. What are some of those things that are distorting our development in unhealthy ways in childhood?
There are two things. One is obvious, like when children are mistreated, maltreated, abused, sexually, physically, emotionally, when there's violence in the family or a parent is caught up in addiction or where there's a rancorous divorce and a lot of conflict in the home, children are just wounded, period. But it's more insidious and more ubiquitous than that, because children have certain basic needs. Now, if you want to understand a zebra or a whale, where would you study those creatures? In a zoo or an aquarium or out there in nature? Same with human beings. So you have to actually look at what are the evolutionary determined needs of human beings as inculcated or instilled in us through our evolutionary history. And so we evolved with certain needs. There used to be this belief that children are what are called a tabula rasa, an empty slate. You can just write whatever you want on it, program the child in any way you want. That used to be the prevailing belief. It's not the true. Children are born with not only just certain needs, but certain inherent expectations. So, to give an example, your lungs are an inherent expectation for oxygen, because they've developed in response to oxygen. If there'd be no oxygen in the environment, we'd have no lungs. In the same way with the human child, it has certain inherent expectations. And you can wound kids not just by maltreating them, but by not meeting those expectations. When I say expectation, I don't mean a conscious expectation. I mean an expectation inherent in the organism. So children need unconditional loving acceptance by multiple adult caregivers, which is how we evolved in hunter-gatherer groups and lived that way for millions and hundreds of thousands of years. Children have a need not to have to work to make the relationship with the parents work. So children need rest from having to struggle to make the relationship functional. So they don't have to be pretty or cute or compliant or clever or successful or any of that stuff. They just need to be. And they don't have to work at getting the parents to accept them. That's an essential need of the child. When I say essential, I mean if it's not met, that'll distort child development. The third need is really crucial, and in our society, it's hardly ever met, which is the child needs the freedom to experience all the emotions that nature has endowed her or him with. So we have certain brain circuits for anger, for love, for play, for lust, for seeking, curiosity. All these circuits are there for a reason. We share them with other animals. We share them with bear cubs and puppies and little whales, elephant. They need to develop because they're there for a reason. Evolution gave it to us. In our society, parents are often advised and taught to suppress certain emotional experiences on the part of the child. That's a wound to the child, which distorts their development and has significant implications for health later on. The fourth need fourth essential need is free play out in nature. Free play, spontaneous, creative, imaginative play. But that's essential for healthy brain development. We share that with other animals. Baby elephants play, bear cubs play, puppies play, lion cubs play. Crucial for brain development. We know that now. In our society, we put cognitive development way ahead of play, and we deprive our children of play by giving them gadgets, which deprives them of imagination. So we're actually undermining their brain development and their healthy unfolding as human beings. So children can be wounded, not just by bad things happening to them, but by their needs not being met. And in our society, when you ask about the environmental conditions that undermine health and child development, these environmental conditions in our society are inimical to healthy human unfoldment. No wonder we have so many children in trouble with anxiety and ADHD and depression, and the rate of childhood suicide is going up, and the number of kids being medicated with heavy-duty medications, multiplicity of medications is going up. Why? Because the conditions for healthy development are less and less available to them, not because parents don't love their kids, not because they're not trying to do their best, but because of the conditions under which parenting takes place in this society.
Yeah, just to share some of those stats that are in the book that Dr. Maté is referring to, we have in 2019, more than 50 million Americans, over 20% of the US adults suffered an episode of mental illness. Rates of obesity, along with the multiple health risks it possesses, are going up in many countries, including Canada, Australia, and notably the United States, where over 30% of the adult population reach the criteria. And then this part, millions of North American children and youths are being medicated with stimulants, antidepressants, and even antipsychotic drugs whose long-term effects on the developing brain are yet to be established. So, you share all these insights and research and work. What I'm interested by is, let's say a child today is raised in that way. I find it fascinating that if you then migrate that child into the real world, and for everyone who's listening, I'm doing my quotation marks, like real world, they walk into this conditioned world that we currently have. If we almost raised a village of children in a, I don't know what the right word is, but I guess in a more natural way, but then they evolved and had to get a job and work in the world, how would they function? What would be your take on how they would do? Is there any research on that? Or what would be your thoughts about how they would deal with the then capitalist society that is drilled around results and performance and being beautiful or smart or cute? How would they react to that?
That question actually has been studied to some degree, and they would not automatically buy into the values. So they may need to get a job, but they wouldn't identify themselves with the job. And they wouldn't judge themselves based on the external values of success. They would also enter the world with a sense of purpose. And I know purpose is very important to you. So a sense of purpose can only arise from us if we're in touch with our real selves. So they would be in the world, but they wouldn't be of the world in a sense. They wouldn't identify themselves with the values that society would push on them. So I think they would struggle, but they would do reasonably well, and they'd hold on to themselves in the process. They wouldn't live a life that's based on what do other people think about me? Am I pretty enough? Do they find me attractive? Have I collected enough goods and objects to make me feel okay about myself? They wouldn't buy into all that. And to the extent that this has been studied, and it has been, those people that can be in this society without buying into its values tend to be healthier and more grounded emotionally.
The reason why I love hearing that is because it's the first time I've connected these ideas together, that when I was born and raised in London, I was born and raised with all the usual pursuits. I have a good education, a good home, a good financial situation, etc. Those were the ways I was raised, and success was a big part of my culture.
Yeah.
And I chased the validation of my family and the external surroundings and my community and what my aunts and uncles thought of me. And when that validation was dissatisfying or didn't feel like it was actually coming my way, and when I was finally introduced to the monks at 18, I then sought the validation of the monks, only for them to teach me that the issue wasn't who you seek validation from. The issue was seeking validation
In the first place.
In the first place. And so what you've just said to me is in 3 years, I got a crash course in what you're saying, where we spent more time in nature.
Yeah.
We were trained in unlearning the behaviors and habits that I'd developed for 21 years at the time.
Yeah.
And then when I came back into the world, the way you just described that is exactly how I felt. Like I almost felt like a new person coming back into the same world that I left with a completely different approach and a different map of how to navigate it. And you're spot on. It's still hard. It's not that it's perfect and it's easy, and it's not that I've got it right. It's just that when I am challenged, I have a toolkit or I have some ideas, as you said, with purpose that help me think about the problem differently. You're not governed by the same thing. So when I went into the world of work, and I just want to give people a practical example of what Dr. Maté is saying is spot on. When I went into the world of work, we were all told that we had to be good at a list of like 10 things in order to succeed.
Yeah.
And I looked at that list of 10 and I was like, I can do one of those things really well. And I'm only going to focus on that one because these other 9 are not my nature. They're not my purpose. And it's so strange because that one thing made me extremely successful at the company I worked at, and then has become how I built my career. And it's so true that had I gone in and done what 90% of people did, I would have become what 90% of people are doing. That really deeply resonates. What is the difference though with, and I can't wait to read some of that research on that. I think that's fascinating. When you have a culture where I think most people who read this book today, The Myth of Normal, will say that they can relate to having trauma, illness, and trying to be on the path of healing, especially our community here. They are absolutely going to love this book. This is exactly why we have this show. But I find that we would all agree, I think if I asked everyone to put up their hands and say, how many people feel they experienced a traumatic environment at home? I think most people would raise their hands. If I asked how many people felt when they were children that they had unhealthy relationships with their parents to some degree, I think most people will put their hand up.
Yeah.
The challenge I find is that I really feel with what you're saying with the book, there's a difference between what you're saying and then the other extreme, which is mollycoddling. So there's neglect and then there's mollycoddling. And I find that as humans, our brains are wired for extremes. So if we've seen that being mistreated or neglected is really bad for us, we go the opposite way and we go, okay, now I'm going to make sure that this kid has like 24 cushions around it.
I'd be curious to know. I like to answer that question because it's a very important one. Yeah. But I just want to know exactly what you mean by mollycoddling.
What I see, and I'm talking about people that I know and people that will speak to me, is that anyone who had a tough childhood are then trying to create a scenario for their child where that child experiences no pain.
They no longer respond to the child needs. They're coming from their own anxieties.
Yes.
So mollycoddling has got nothing to do with the child. It has to do with the anxieties of the parents. That kid is going to download the anxieties of the parents. So mollycoddle kids become very anxious and very scared and very ungrounded in themselves. On the other hand, it's not possible to love kids too much. In fact, there's a very interesting study where they looked at a large number of mothers and their infants in the early few months. And most mothers in this study were seen as really good mothers, and some were a bit distant and because of their own traumas, not as available. And a small group were seen as like super loving in how they doted over their infants. Okay? 30 years later, they looked at these infants now as adults. The ones that were most emotionally grounded and healthy were the ones who received the super loving. So there's a difference between, you can't love a child too much. So the mollycoddling that you describe is not a child being loved too much. It's a child who has to endure the anxieties of the parents. And there's a very famous example in world history of someone whose parents wanted to protect him from suffering was the Buddha. He never saw death, he never saw illness, he never saw old age until he goes out and sees a dying person, sees a very poor person, a very ill person, a very old person. He realizes there's suffering in the world. So all the mollycoddling he received could not ultimately protect him from the awareness of pain and vulnerability. Although, if I talk about the Buddha, I also have to say that his own trauma is often not talked about because his mother died when he was a week old, or right after birth, didn't she? So even they tried to protect him, they couldn't. But so anyway, mollycoddling has got nothing to do with the needs of the child.
Yeah, that's a great differentiator.
It has to do with the unmet needs of the parents. And as soon as parents project their needs onto the child, they no longer see the child as they exist. They see their own anxieties, their fears, and their own fantasies. Naturally, that's going to hurt the child.
Yeah, that's such a great differentiator. Again, it's a trauma response.
It's a trauma response.
Yeah, it's a trauma response. How and when should children, young adults be exposed to pain in order to develop their vulnerability? Like, as you said, the capacity to experience a wound. Like, how and when do we allow ourselves? How should we? What environment is required to allow ourselves to experience pain in a healthy way? Or is it just going to come anyway?
It's the nature of life. There's no reason to deliberately expose children to pain because they're going to experience it. The question is, how do we support them when they do? You know why? Because their puppy's going to die. Because grandfather is going to die. Because some neighborhood friend won't want to play with them. Because they're not going to get the toy they wanted. Because some disappointment will happen. So pain is inevitable. But it doesn't have to become traumatic if the child is supported in experiencing the pain and moving past it. So we don't have to impose or bring pain into kids' life to train them. Life's going to do that. The question is, how are we to interact with them while they're enduring the pain?
Yeah, and what would you say those are? Obviously, there's the love part, which you spoke about, but when a child is going through something like that, so let's talk about loss, because I think that's a big one, right? Like whether it's losing a parent or losing a puppy, as you said, or even if it's not losing a parent to death, it's losing a parent to a divorce. It's,
for example,
correct. Yeah. So grief and loss doesn't have to mean end of life. It can be everything.
Exactly.
Or a loss of a country. What are the steps that someone should take in order to helps guide through anyone through loss, not just a child?
Well, interestingly enough, when I spoke about these brain circuits that we share with other mammals for play and for loving and seeking, we also have a brain circuit for panic and grief. Why do we have that? Because life brings loss. And so grief is essential for life, because grief is coming to terms with the fact that something is gone, is not going to come back.